Hello, welcome. All right, and so let me get your names down. So welcome to the class. So if you had a chance to read my first um, announcement, you'll see that I have a specific style. All right. So this is the sample argument. I'm going to share the page. So there are lots of different styles and schools of history, right? Like when a historian does his or her thing, they select facts, and of course, when they select facts, they conveniently omit other facts that might not go with their thesis. They start with certain presuppositions and assumptions that maybe they should not have. And then they interpret, and sometimes historians interpret the same data in a different way, um, and then they present it. So there's a lot of subjectivity in history. It's not 2 + 2 = 4 by any means. And so coming across that as a history major, and especially when I got my master's, it was just a lot of comparing different historians' takes on the same topic, and they could be very different. And so that's what convinced me to do this style, okay, in my class. So I introduced you in the announcement to some of the terms that we'll be using throughout the year. So I may go over some of them now in case you haven't had a chance to read it. So you have court history, all right, COURT, and that's like when an emperor would ask his or her scribe to write a historical account of him and his reign. Well, of course, right? If that scribe wanted to keep his head, he's going to rationalize and justify everything that the emperor had done. He's going to, you know, um, praise the emperor, and that's exactly what court history does. And so, when you look at the three categories that we borrow from sociology, political, right, with government, economic, which is self-explanatory, and social, like with values and culture. Uh, if you especially have quote winners who kind of control the culture, the lion's share of resources and government, they would arguably be considered the winners in history. So you think of the founding fathers, etc., right? In this class. So you would praise them. And then also a part of court history for US history is you would contend that we're an exceptional country, right? We claim to be special, different in a good way from other nations. And so one part of that is that we're exceptionally idealistic. If you're idealistic, you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be, and you try to improve man, institutions, the country, the environment, etc. Right? That we're supposedly a land of freedom, and we're a land of equality of economic opportunity, right? To chase after that ever elusive American dream. So at any rate, that would be court history. And of course, many of the initial accounts of presidents are court history. Then when you want to change, challenge, revise that kind of rose-colored picture, you would call it revisionist history. Okay. And so revisionist history oftentimes would say, okay, no, George Washington is not a hero. He was a slave-owning hypocrite, okay, an elitist. And so that would be a revisionist take on a leader, on a leader. Yeah. So you have revisionist history, and then along with revisionist history, you have conflict history, and that focuses upon conflict and competition. But in their case, right, what they do is they want you to empathize with those who lost, right? So a term I'll use sometimes is demographic. A demographic is just a category of the population. So demographics are like by ethnicity, by age, by their socioeconomic condition, what they do for a living and how much money they make and how prestigious it is. Those would be examples of demographic. So the demographics that, quote, lose, right, in conflict history, they want you to empathize with them. They want you to feel a sense of like righteous anger, like indignation, that they have been marginalized, right? And marginalized means that they've been kind of kicked to the corner and not given the same opportunities as other people to participate in the institutions of the country, or they've been exploited, taken advantage of, right, or oppressed. So at any rate, that's conflict history. And then like when you get into causation, that's big, because it's very subjective. Like what causes events to go in the direction in which they go? So you have some people, especially if you are a court historian, you're going to lean toward beliefs and culture, right? And the fancy word for it is ideological causation, that you believe ideals or beliefs cause events to happen in the direction in which they go. And then if you are a material determinist, you believe that it's more material factors like desire for power and money. Okay. Then also with causation, you have great man history. And it doesn't mean necessarily that the man is great morally, but really it's almost a misnomer. It should be called powerful man history. But with great man history, you believe that if you want to understand why and how America went in the directions in which it went, you need to look at those in positions of great power. So mainly, right, like presidents and their cabinets and Congress. So you look at them, you read biographies of their personalities, their decisions, their behavior, etc. And to you, that explains why things happen the way that they did. Then you also have, on the other end of the spectrum, you have structural history coming from France. And the historians in France, the structuralists, they said, no, I don't care if you're a president, I don't care if you're a king. There are big, faceless, invisible forces always at work that are more determinate in how things and where things go than any individual, even in power. And so hence the two examples, right, that you often get with structural history are economics and culture. Okay. So at any rate, and then you have functionalist history. And with functionalist history, right, like functional theory and sociology, you have you don't want to play the blame game. You don't want to make heroes of anybody or villains of anybody or victims of anybody. What you simply do is you look at each demographic as like a body part, and all of them together make the metaphoric human body that is the United States. So let's say the legs keeping everything functioning is slave labor. Okay, so then instead of going about everything that they suffered, injustices and so forth, what you would do instead is you would simply focus upon how the cash crops that were made by slave labor contributed to the entire economy, and that's their part in the functioning of the whole society. So, like I said, it's kind of it's non-confrontational. You don't get into blame game or anything like that with functional history. You just see the function of every demographic. And then also, lastly, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, people of color, especially, were tired of this new fad in the 60s of writing how they had been victimized, right, in America's past. They said there's got to be more to it than that, right? That just showing us and depicting us as victims. What about our children reading in the history books? Yeah, they deserve to know what had happened to their ancestors, but it does nothing to uplift them, right? Or give them hope and so forth and identity. So at any rate, they said we need to focus upon our own people's agency, AGENCY. An agency is when you look at a demographic that was usually considered victimized, right? Exploited, marginalized, etc., oppressed, enslaved, and you show how even they had the power of human agency. They had free will, and they made decisions that mattered. They made decisions and did things to help contribute to the direction in which American history went. So that would be considered agency. Okay. So at any rate, those are kind of some of the main historiographical trends that I've come across reading different history books. And that's the first thing I do when I begin reading a book. I'm like, okay, this guy's coming from this point, from this vantage point. Okay, he's assuming that this causes things to happen, etc. And it's good to know that. And I want you to be able to pinpoint that and figure that out. And I think after doing these exercises, you will be. Okay. So and plus I don't want to try to indoctrinate you. I could take my own assumptions, my own beliefs about what causes things to happen most prevalently, and put them into my own monolithic take or narrative on things, and then try to ask you to memorize that. But I think that's very arrogant, and I think it's very narrow-minded. And it doesn't, memorization is the lowest form of critical thinking. So at any rate, what I try to do is one section to the next on each topic, I try to give you a different slant, a different view, a different type of history on the same topic. So it helps you to be a more critical thinker and more critical reader for those of you who are continuing in history. And if not in history, just as a citizen of the US, to not simply imbibe what you read or what you're told, but to be critical of it and to look at all possible facets and sides of the same issue. Okay. I like to think also that it makes history a little less boring for those of you who are taking this because you have to and aren't necessarily interested in history. Okay. So I believe firmly in my my pedagogy, my teaching style. All right. And so I try to give you an example. And what I do here, right, is I do kind of the granted but approach. I say, granted, there are some seemingly impressive scientific methods into finding out what happened with the Native Americans long before the Europeans came. Because unfortunately, we have a scarcity of written accounts. When you look at the Mesoamericans, they had books that were called codices. Singular, it's called codex. They had codices, the Aztec and the Maya particularly. And we've been able to learn and glean a lot of information about their history, about their culture, about their institutions from those codices. But we don't have that luxury here in U.S. territory. So there's a scarcity of written accounts. And also there were stelae, right? And stelae are those big stone monuments that have hieroglyphic writings on them. And usually they're kind of court political history of what the king did and what he accomplished in the major event of each year that they put on the stelae. We don't have that up here. So we have to infer. We have to find a fact here, find a fact there, and try to connect the dots logically. Okay. So what do we have to use for that inference? We have dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, okay, to time something. We have radiocarbon dating or carbon-14 dating, right? Then you have thermoluminescence dating. And what they do is they're able to reheat something and figure out when it was first heated, when that pot or ceramic, etc., was first made. They have stratigraphy. Somewhere here should be stratigraphy. And stratigraphy is, I think, is fascinating. It's down by the bottom of the sentence. What happens, right, is as things naturally erode and sink, they hit hard pan, limestone, etc., and they have to stop at that level. And so you get over a certain, hard stone of some sort. And if you find at that same level above that stone, let's say 25 feet below the ground, and you look at key nutrients, I guess, like nitrogen, and if the composition of that soil is uniform, is the same over the top of that hard surface, then you feel you can make the conclusion that everything at that same level is contemporaneous. It was at the same time. It was from the same time. So we lucked out, right, on a few findings at the same stratigraphic level underground over the same hard surface. We found a mastodon, and the mastodon had been hit in the rib cage with an intelligently designed uh, flute chert arrow tip. And then also at the same level as the mastodon, you had a human bones. And so they and atlatl, their old weapon prior to the bow and arrow. And so they felt safe to assume, you know, something that's not a coincidence. They were contemporaneous. Man lived along with the megafauna, the big animals like the woolly mammoth, etc., and the mastodon, and he hunted them, obviously. So that'd be an example of using stratigraphy. Okay, they have pollen analysis. They have epidemiology, study of diseases. With the suboceanic isotope analysis, it's over my head, but that is what they use to discern if and when there have been ice ages. Okay, and so molecular and evolutionary biology, etc. So some of that stuff is really impressive, right? But then I do the but part, right? And what I do is I poke holes. I show instances in which these methods don't work. These methods might yield false information. So C14, right? Especially since we have dropped nuclear weapons and we've used nuclear energy, it may have affected the barometric pressure and the amount of C14 in the atmosphere. And if that is the case, then C14 dating may not be accurate, right? Let's see here. Then you had, and I had a quote there, radioactive decay is a random process that cannot be predicted with certainty, from Dr. McIntosh. And then dendrochronology, the trees must be, quote, sensitive and not complacent, okay? And they must not have missing or false rings. And that messes everything up with dendrochronology if they do. And the list goes on here of things that could go wrong with some of these methods, right? And then my main point in trying to demonstrate that science is highly faulty is C. Vance Haynes' thesis, right? He stated, and I remember as a kid learning this as like it being the absolute truth, that 13,000 years ago in the last Wisconsin ice era, there was an ice age, the last ice age, and during which levels through displacement into ice, the water levels greatly sank, and they're able to traverse by foot across the shallow Bering Sea from Alaska to Canada and down into the Americas. And also, it supposedly works out that there is evidence of major glaciers, sheets that have receded and turned into lakes that covered an area over all of Western Canada, with the exception of about 1.5 miles width, where they did not quite touch. So through that 1.5 miles width between the glaciers, right, they call it the ice-free corridor, they believe the Native Americans must have walked and traversed down it. And so, however, right, you see here in Monteverde in Chile, Boqueiro de Pedra Furada in Brazil, they've carbon dated human remains to 30,000 years ago, right? And then they went through the ice-free corridor and they found very little evidence of a carbon footprint. And a carbon footprint is evidence of having traversed through there, having lived in that area, right? You're going to leave your proverbial Burger King wrappers, refuse, bones of people that died, etc. You would leave some type of trail of human habitation and travel, and they haven't, in hunting, and they haven't found much at all. So therefore, I'm saying so much for C. Vance Haynes' theory, right? If we could believe these much older carbon dates and believe that because there is little, if any, evidence through the ice-free corridor, that it didn't happen. So, by the way, some historians then began to wonder if they went through the Aleutian Islands by boat, boats made of tule reed, because tule reed is biodegradable, and they would have just like disappeared by now. So, because of that, I reiterate at the end that we can't see, while science has made some astoundingly impressive inferences, it has not and likely cannot ever render a definitive account of Native American history before Columbus's arrival. So that is my opinionated take on it. And remember, these aren't mine. This is stuff I read. This is a lecture I sat under, etc. Right? I'm almost like acting when I write these out. So here's my response, right? That science can only get us so far in forming a narrative of the past of Native Americans. It begins by granting a concession to the opposing argument that methods like C14 dating, digital chronology, etc., shed light in forming an historical narrative. It then provokes skepticism about such methods, showing their limitations and citing exceptional circumstances in which those methods will fail to yield definitive information. So what did I just do? I just summed up the thesis, okay? And then note, I give an example or two. For instance, an example of data that's used to support it. It states that digital chronology will not work with complacent trees, carbon-14 dating. If the atmosphere has not remained constant, it doesn't work. But the primary piece of evidence used is refuting C. Vance Haynes' thesis about 13,000 years ago, right? So at any rate, I gave the thesis and I gave a couple examples used to defend that thesis. That would constitute the analysis. Then the evaluation is all you. And basically, if you look at it, what I say, right, is I disagree with this write-up and this argument because it wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because you could find some out of the ordinary, aberrant cases in which these methods don't work or yield false information doesn't mean you should get rid of those methods. That those methods could be fine-tuned, and that there's still hope that we could come up with a definitive narrative of what happened with the ancient Native Americans using these methods. Okay, so I disagreed with it. And you feel free to disagree with everything you read. Just tell me why. All right. Are there any questions? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the next one. Let's see here. So number 2 is quite simple, okay? Is that I put it down at the bottom, all right, to have you think about as a reference point. Let's see here. Early modern, and we're talking about like the 1600s or so is early modern era. Early modern European colonizers of the Americas came up with this theory on human cultural evolution, how we've evolved culturally from the beginning of time. It has been supported by anthropology. Anthropology still kind of makes this assumption, right? There's a book called Sapiens that was widely read, and it just gives the anthropological view of human development throughout the globe, and it pretty much follows this path right here. So they contend, right, that man at one point advances from small band hunter-gatherer stage to begin the Neolithic or New Stone Tool or farming revolution. And then he starts to build a city, and he builds great monuments. So those would be examples of manipulation of the environment, okay? Then when man creates farming and so forth, right? Especially when he supposedly does it in large scale, there might need to be coercion, right? You have to organize and semi-coerce people to do the hard work of farming. And so you're going to have a leadership. You're going to have some type of autocratic ruler, an emperor, a chief, a king, right? You're going to have members of his family most of the time who are considered the aristocracy. And remember, aristoi in Greek means the best. So they contend that they come from the best bloodline and they're entitled to their powerful position. Then you are going to face the vagaries of weather and climate. And because you cannot control those, there's going to be the human temptation to try to do so by way of religion. So you develop some type of sophisticated religion that has perhaps a written sacred book, that has a priestly elite that explains how we got here from God or from the gods, that explains just the major rites of passage and how things are the way they are. But also, of course, you're going to have shaman, these religious intermediaries who go between mankind and the gods, and also oftentimes the spirits of ancestors. So as intermediaries, these shaman, what they try to do is they oftentimes try to placate the gods, make them happy. And it's usually has involved some type of sacrifice, some type of abstinence and holiness. And holiness, right, is that you're separating the realm of the gods from the profane, from the daily regular stuff. And so you form this priestly elite and religion. Then you also, right, you're going to need people to manufacture. Also, you're going to need people to distribute the food according to need, oftentimes, because capitalism was not heard of. And so, according to need, you're going to have to form a bureaucracy that's going to feed the people, that's going to tax the people and take tribute from them to the royal leaders and so forth. So you develop a bureaucracy, and oftentimes that has resulted in devising a mathematical system of counting and writing. Then you also once kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? MASLOW. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? He says first you need to feel safe, comfortable, and have your basic needs met. Then when you have that, then you start looking to finer, higher things, right? And one of those things is like, aesthetics. Aesthetics is the enjoyment of beauty. So you can have people that make nice clothing, known as textiles, jewelry, right? And other fine things. And so you'll have people making that. Then also to facilitate farming, you're going to have people that make some type of tools and instruments to more efficiently farm. So you have those. And then it just develops into an array of different industries, and they're collectively known as artisans or skilled workers. So you develop an artisan class as well. And then you're not going to always have everything that you desire in your enclosed community. So you send merchants out to other communities to trade. Okay. And so, and needless to say, right, harvest time, someone could come and steal your harvest. Law and order at home. For various reasons, you're going to want to develop a military. Okay. So that's generically known as the development of a complex society. All right. And then again, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the desire for aesthetics, not only do you enjoy beauty and the more comfortable things of life, you become a little bit more entitled, etc., as you get more comfortable economically. But you also start looking into the more esoteric parts of life, right? And the esoteric things are like things that are highly intangible, like why are we here? Philosophy and religion and music and literature and poetry, etc. So you're supposed to develop the arts and sciences as well in developing a complex society, and comfortable and, quote, civilized. And then, of course, technological growth stands for itself. And with religion, of course, the Native Americans had no chance. Not only were they not monotheistic, believing in just one God, but of course, how could they believe in the European Trinity of Father, Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit when they've never heard of it? So they're all going to fail on the fifth one. So going back up here, what I do is I say the Europeans wanted to depict the Native Americans as being primitive and backward, etc. Right? And of course, I say, how convenient, because then they could very paternalistically, right, like a dad, they could paternalistically come in and say, well, we're going to uplift these primitive savages and we're going to civilize them. We're going to bring civilization to them. And it's just one more justification for taking their land. Okay. But I'm saying is, just as that simplistic depiction of Native Americans was convenient for taking land from them, it also was erroneous. It was false. It was untrue. So then what I began to do is I tried to defend by the Europeans' criteria that we just went over, how impressively the Native Americans met that criteria. Of course, with the exception of religion. So the first thing I go over is the change from being hunter-gatherers to farming, to the Neolithic or farming revolution. Well, actually, the first thing I do is show how densely populated it was, because they said it was virtually empty land, and that was a lie. It was very densely populated and very diverse. But in addition to that, right, I make a comparison right here. For instance, he contends that Sumer and the Near East easily predated other old world sites and engaging in agriculture 11,000 years ago, while domestication of plants may have occurred in the Americas as long as 10,000 years in the past. So that's a darn good comparison. If you're, trying to measure how well they evolved culturally by this subjective European criteria. Okay. So the early ones, of course, are in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica means Middle America, and they're talking about mainly the Yucatan of Mexico, the Valley of Deep Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. Okay. So at first you have depictions of, you have the findings of the Olmec, right? They're the ones with the big stone heads. And I show how they began the calendar system that the Maya perfected. They had a writing system. The stones themselves were amazing, and how they're able to move them, we still don't know. They had large populations at La Venta and San Lorenzo, the Olmec that is. They had artisans who engaged in sculpting. They had a tower that was into astronomy or astrology. Okay. Then in addition to that, you had Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan was about the time of Christ, or about 100 BC. And Teotihuacan, right? You have, like, remember the Camino de los Muertos, like the path of the dead, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon. It's amazing, the architecture of these pyramids. And then at certain times, with the winter solstice and the summer solstice, etc., you have the planet Venus come up perfectly over the top of the pyramids. So they clearly knew their astronomy, especially with Venus, because it was significant to their religion. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent that was so big with the Aztec, he was said to have retrieved the bones of mankind from Xibalba, from the underworld, and brought them up and risen up to the planet Venus. So at any rate, their knowledge of the movements of the sun, the constellations, with the planet Venus, very impressive. And then, of course, right, from 250 to 800 AD, and that's still pretty darn early, the Maya. And of course, they had Palenque, Monte Alban, Tikal, no, not Teotihuacan. That was not Maya. But at any rate, just very, very fascinating culture, right? So they had codices first, the written books with hieroglyphic writing in them. They had the stelae with the hieroglyphic writing on the stones. They had streets that were in line with celestial, objects up in the sky. They had astrological towers. Their 365-day calendar. They would revise it every year, just a bit, like our equivalent of having leap year every 4 years, to account for the fact that a year is technically like 365 and a quarter days. They knew that, and they accounted for it. They had a mathematical system that worked to high numbers. A line was 5 years and a dot was 1. So if you had a line with 3 dots over it, that would be 8. And you go from bottom up. So you read the bottom number, and then the one above, you discover the number with the dots and bars, and you multiply it by 20. And then the third level is 20 times 20, or 400, and so forth. And it keeps going up, so they could deal with very high numbers. Okay. So at any rate, and needless to say, they had an aqueduct system with canals and irrigation. Yeah, and just the list goes on and on with the Maya. All right, and then of course the Aztec. The Aztec made their own codices. They used that same calendar that the Maya had. And by the way, the calendar was not just pictographic of pictures, it also was phonetic. There's also a symbol for a sound on how to pronunciate it, and it made it much more versatile. And so it's all the more impressive to Europeans and Americans today. They had, goodness, they had, as you see here, a library, a zoo, a hospital. They had a 2-tiered public school system. And when Hernan Cortez came to Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City, his mouth dropped. And he pretty much said, like, Seville has nothing on this place. So at any rate, then when you get into present U.S. territory, chronologically first, meeting this criteria in the narrative has been the Pueblo. Pueblo means city in Spanish because they developed cities when the Spanish found them. And that's in the Southwest, ironically in the arid, dry Southwest. And they used an ingenious canal and irrigation system to catch what little water they could find to farm. They had buildings with hundreds of rooms. And the buildings, right, were not just made of the stone of the cliffs against which they rested. It also involved masonry. Okay. So you have Snaketown, Mesa Grande, Casa Grande, Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito. Look any of these up. They're impressive looking. And again, the streets were in line with constellations of stars. They had something special for the planet Venus. Their writings were Nahuatl, and Nahuatl was a language of the Aztec. So they clearly had some type of connections with the Aztec down in the Valley of Mexico. Right. So at any rate, they had widespread trade, multiple classes, large populations. Okay. They grew the, quote, 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, which was so prominent in the Americas. Okay. Now, however, with the Mississippian people, right, there might be a change in this narrative, because what they increasingly are finding about the people that seem very mysterious and known as the Adena, their findings keep getting carbon dated earlier and earlier. So mysterious. The size of their kings, buried with all this ornate jewelry and all this nice stuff. We're talking well over 6 feet tall, much taller than the people buried in mass burials around them. You have kilns, KILNS, and that is when you engage in some type of metallurgical process of making something like copper or iron, etc. That has not been known prior to the Adena to have happened. Now they mined like jade and limestone, etc., but not like an artificial metal like you see here with the Adena, like the Europeans did. So it's going to be exciting the more they find on the Adena. And so and then by about 1200 AD, you had Cahokia, and that was in present St. Louis, Missouri. And they're known as part of the mound culture. They had these real large mounds. People are buried within those mounds. They engaged in religious rituals. They had a pretty dense population from the burials around them. And they had multiple classes, farming on a large scale, etc. All right. And then later on, you had the Iroquois. We're going to talk more about them on the last one. So as you see here, what I'm saying, right, is it's just simply not true. This narrative of Native Americans being backward and primitive. If you want to play the European game and play by the same criteria that the Europeans use, these 5 criteria here, the Native Americans fare pretty darn well. Okay. And by the way, with technological growth, just the canal system and the drawbridges and the limestone buildings and the running water of the Aztec were amazing feats technologically for the 1400s. Then on this one, right, I'm saying it's not fair, but it happened. It is what it is. It just happened, however unfair it is. Okay. And that is for the following reasons. The Europeans began to hold the Native Americans a little bit in disdain. Remember, disdain is like, oh, you're gross, you're beneath me, right? It's a little bit of malice. It's a lot of arrogance and like condescension, like they're inferior to you. And thus they began to even more so engage in taking advantage of the Native Americans for the following reasons. Okay. One was the incompatibility between Native American religion and Christianity, whether it was Protestant of the Dutch and the English, or Catholic of the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese. Okay. So when they came in, right, polytheism, the belief in multiple gods, right? Clearly that's not going to fly with the monotheistic Christians. With the idea of pantheism, of the spirit, the great spirit, we're all part collectively of the whole, and so hence we have part of the divine in us, and so do rocks and trees and fish and deer, etc. That we're all part of the great spirit, interconnected, and we're all just going to join in another form after we die. That type of pantheism, that didn't fly with the Christians, with the Europeans, right? They thought that was silly, that mankind was clearly created by God, and he's not holy like God. He's separate from God. He's not a part of him. He's not going to become another creature when he dies, etc. And then also some parts of the Native American religions, of course, made the Europeans believe that the Native Americans were unknowingly following the devil. So like in the Aztec pantheon, right? Huitzpochtli, he literally was the evil twin of Quetzalcoatl, also known as Tezcatlipoca. He was the evil twin to Quetzalcoatl. Okay. And he became a war god and became the patron god of the Aztec. His temple of Huitzpochtli had snakes, right? And Montezuma brought Cortez in there to check it out. And Montezuma sees snakes, right? And he, as a Catholic, identifies snakes with the devil in the Garden of Eden, right, in the Bible. And also the bright morning star, Venus, right, in the book of Isaiah, evidently, it says that Satan fell from heaven, and he was known as the bright morning star. So literally, the Europeans identified the planet Venus as the bright morning star, and hence they identified it with Satan. And of course, Venus was huge to the Mesoamerican religions. So just one more thing, right, that made them feel like the natives were completely wrong in their religion, and they needed to be they needed to assimilate and become Christians, right? You also have you had a story in San Diego. The missionaries and the soldiers came up, and they meet with the chief, and the chief says, "I must confer with my augurs," right? Augurs, those who do the sorcery to give him a message about the future. And his augur was a big black crow, and it started letting out a screech that highly frightened the Spaniards. And one of the Spaniards pulled out his harquebus, his old pistol, and shot and killed it. And the leader turns to him and says, "How could you do that? We can't go to war with them right here and now." And he said, "That was the devil," and he really believed that that was the devil speaking through that crow. So they're very incompatible, the Native American religion with that of the Europeans. And needless to say, any type of human sacrifice or cannibalism did not fly with the Europeans. That was evidence of savagery, right? And whether you were Aztec or Iroquois up in New York, oftentimes your religious reason for ritualistic cannibalism was to imbibe the warrior qualities of the man whose body parts you were cooking and eating. So that was their rationale for engaging in ritualistic cannibalism, but the Europeans were not buying it. Okay. Then, in addition to that, the second reason, besides the incompatibility of religion, right, is you have, let's see here, still on religion. There are different concepts of private property. Okay. For whatever reason, I don't understand why this had to be made into such a big deal. But when you look at the primary sources at that time, the Europeans made a huge deal out of this. Okay. And that is, they had left the feudal system behind largely, right? And with the feudal system, there was kind of a notion of usufruct ownership. And with usufruct means technically someone else owns that land, but you merely have the right to use it. That's it. You could exploit the resources, you could hunt there, you could farm there, but it's not really yours. Okay. Versus, of course, proprietorship. And with proprietorship, you own it. It's yours. It's in your name. It's what we commonly, still identify with, coming from English political tradition to this day, right? If I want to put my car on my front lawn, that's my business. It's my property. So at any rate, the Native Americans believed, right? Again, they believed in pantheism, etc. So they literally believed that the animals and the resources were like animate living objects that gave themselves or could choose not to give themselves to man for man's consumption. So they literally would engage in rituals to try to get the deer, the buffalo, etc., to allow themselves to be hunted and killed and eaten for the good of man. And so hence, like with the land, when it has its own identity like that, right? That to the Native Americans, that is the epitome of arrogance for man to think that he could own the land, right? Because he's going to return to it in death, etc. So the Native Americans had a usufruct notion of land ownership, but clearly the Europeans had a proprietorship notion that you're the bona fide owner and boss of that land. So you had misunderstandings that quite often happen, especially like with the Dutch and the natives of New York. And that for whatever reasons, that the Europeans made a big deal out of this and thought it was evidence of the Native Americans' primitive status. Okay. And then in addition to that, is the natives could have used, they supposedly in the popular narrative, and I've read this from a few books, not just one, the natives had quite some leverage initially, but they didn't tend to take advantage of that leverage. And the leverage, of course, was the land that they had, was the mineral wealth that they had, gold and silver, etc. Right? There was a third one. I'm trying to think of it. But and then also their labor. There was a need for their labor. But there was another one, and I am not thinking of it right now. I apologize. But at any rate, with this, right, is you have the historical account, and of course you got to remember this is written by the Europeans. The accounts that we have, the Europeans contend that the Native Americans were naive. They were, quote, foolish, that they didn't realize the leverage they had, and they allowed the Europeans to easily take advantage of them in trade. Okay. Take much from them and give the Native Americans very little in return. Right. And then lastly, the Iroquois is what I state is if you take things out of context, and remember, context is the surrounding situation, the surrounding conditions, right? The whole picture. You've got to, when you do history, right? You've got to always study the context. What's the culture like? What economically is going on at that time? What politically is going on at that time? What had happened just prior to this, et cetera, right? So at any rate, with the Iroquois, you had a guy named Van der Donk and a couple other Dutch gentlemen who claimed to be chroniclers. And these chroniclers, right? They were Europeans who came, however briefly, and observed Native American tribes and wrote these bestseller books in their accounts of them. Okay. So, needless to say, they're coming to the Native Americans with a very Eurocentric worldview, right? They're looking at things and judging all things by their own European ideology, their own European worldview. Okay. They're not spending that much time with them. They're not well versed in their history and tradition, but they're simply writing down what they observe, right? So Van der Donk, he depicts, right, the Iroquois attacking a village of people. They take for themselves. They seize prisoners of war. They bring them back. They ask the elderly women, okay, who would you like to have join our tribe? And they might choose a few, okay, to be, quote, adopted. And then they would say, would you like any of them to be put to death? And sometimes the women, the elderly women, would point to certain people and say that they would. So at any rate, they'd put them to death. And then there was always the third group with which they were uncertain, right? And so in that uncertainty, they would make them run the gauntlet, as the Dutch termed it. Could you guys give me just 1 minute? I'm so sorry. Give me just a minute. Thank you very much. My father came to the door and he just kept ringing and ringing the door. It would not stop, but I had to come and tell him what was going on. I apologize. Um, so as they're running the gauntlet, right? The Iroquois would take out their weapons and they would have to somehow run through two lines of men facing each other in close proximity with weapons in hand, and they would have to run and fight their way through the gauntlet. And sometimes they would die, they would be murdered, and sometimes they would make it. And with another select group, I forgot there was one more, with those that they were supremely impressed by, they would sacrifice. And they would tie them, it was called the matote. They would tie them to a stake. They would begin burning their flesh at their feet and begin cutting from their flesh and putting it into a pot so that they could eat it, his body parts, and supposedly imbibe his warrior qualities. So this is read by the European public, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, these people are savage." All right, and what I say is, wait a minute, learn the context. Okay, learn the context. So first of all, um, the uh, the rival tribe. Now I got the hiccups. I'm sorry. The rival tribes, like the Huron, Huron, and other tribes, they'd already had a history with the Iroquois Confederacy. Um, and then that was exacerbated by the fact that the Huron were closer to the Dutch, and then after the Dutch, the English that came from Manhattan Island and the coast of New York. And what the Huron and others did is they even used their warriors and architecture and also their diplomacy with the Europeans to try to keep the Iroquois marginalized from their trade with the Europeans. And of course, one thing they were receiving, which was considered highly illegal in most European colonies, is they were receiving guns from some of these European traders, and that was a big game changer, right? In fighting. So at any rate, the Iroquois felt like their days were numbered if they didn't do something. So there was a feeling of vulnerability, of emergency, right? So yes, they attacked, and they took the St. Lawrence River, and then now they could be the providers of the beaver pelts that were so lucrative in Albany, Western New York, where they could trade them for a lot. But on their way to Albany, right, they had to fight their way there through the Huron, etc. So they found themselves fighting a lot. Then, in addition to that, the eventually, after it hit the Huron first, the white man's diseases hit the Iroquois quite harshly. And so when they started losing a lot of warriors and numbers of people and farmers, etc., in their confederation, they began engaging in mourning wars. And I don't mean mourning as a time of day. I mean with a U, Mourning, right? That in the state of mourning the death of many of their people, they had to, in their eyes, attack other villages so that they could forcefully adopt replacements for them. And so that as in times like that, right, the elderly women in charge, actually, in some ways, uh, they chose quite a few people to be adopted into their confederation and their tribe, and they literally were given the name of deceased people, so that they literally were like the substitute of a particular person who had died. Okay, and so so those two examples, right, is, maybe it still doesn't excuse what they did, but it was highly unfair for the Native Americans in their entirety, right, to be labeled as savages because of these books that a couple Dutch chroniclers wrote, just highlighting their barbaric acts without any context whatsoever. Okay. And so, like I said, they were squeezed out of trade. Their enemies were getting guns and they weren't. They were losing large numbers of people. So they had to go and forcefully adopt people in their mourning wars. And then also, right, he didn't write about how impressive their domestic uh, organization was. Is supposedly they had a legend that a mysterious uh, person came out of the woods and told one of the leaders of one of the five tribes of the Iroquois um, that they need to stop killing one another and they need to go through a process of reconciliation. And what he stated is you have regular meetings whereby you, and it was kind of like a republic. So much so that Benjamin Franklin gave credit to the Iroquois for giving him some inspiration in us and then the founding fathers making the republic that we have now. And remember, a republic like Rome's is part democratic. You have some offices that are elected by the people, and then you have some aristocrats who automatically get a position because of bloodline. And then you have some people that serve as like judges. And so at any rate, they had like a republic. And some of the offices were elected by the Iroquois people, and it was impressive. But what they would do, right, is they'd regularly meet. They'd always have a fire burning, and they'd sit opposite of the fire, these different five tribes. And it was like the Mohawk, the Seneca, oh gosh, it's failing me now. I have them in here, but there are five of them. But they would start off by giving gifts to one another, right? And then they would cite any type of injustices, especially murders, that a member of their tribe had, brought about to a member of another tribe. And then they would offer them wampum, their form of money. And, the Germans did this. That was a Germanic, from the Middle Ages and before, Germanic tradition is to try to keep these vendetta wars, right, in check. Someone kills my brother, so I kill him. But then because I killed him, his brother kills me. And then my cousin avenges me and kills him. And it never ends, right? So they say, no, we ought to apologize and give money for the life that was lost and try to placate the tribal leader of whoever was killed so that there isn't further violence. Okay. And it was known as the Great Peace, the League of the Great Peace. So at any rate, and then also at the village level, especially real left-wing historians love this, is the extended family or clan would live together in one longhouse. Sometimes the longhouse was up to 100 feet long and like at least 25 feet wide. And in the longhouse, you had one cooking pot, and everybody would do their part on the same land to farm, to pick, to hunt, and they throw everything together into that pot, and they would all share from that same pot. And so there was a lot of reciprocity. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. We help one another out in their traditions, how the Iroquois lived. So there were some impressive things about the Iroquois, and there was context as to why they did what they did, and none of that was taken into account by the Europeans, right? And they just wrongfully just vilified the Iroquois as savages who loved to inflict bloody damage on people. And then from there, right, people would make those generalizations, going to completely different colonies and encountering completely distant and different native tribes. They made that generalization that these natives entirely, as an entire homogenous, all the same group, are savage people. And I'm writing in the last section how unfair that is. All right, so does anybody have any questions? Do you guys feel like you can do this? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yeah. Thank you for this.
You're very welcome, Lincoln. Thank you. Thank you for staying with me. All right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I feel like I can do it. Thank you.
no problem. Yeah, I didn't get your name down. Thank you for saying something. Okay, great. So you guys, when I grade your first assignment, I'm going to add 5 points to it. All right, for being here today, I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, so yeah, that's what you're doing. You're just gleaning from each section, what the main argument is, a couple of the main points that are used to support that argument, and what you think about it. If you think it's credible, or it's too biased, too narrow, doesn't make logical sense, etc. And I have no problem with you bashing every single one that you read. Like I said, I'm thinking of something that I had read, etc. None of these are necessarily my personal opinion. Right. So good luck with this, okay? And please submit it by, I think you guys have till like Saturday. Yeah, I think Saturday midnight at 8:31 to submit the first one. And just do your best. I'm always easy on the first one anyway. And I'll give you my 2 cents if I think there's something else that I'd like you to add. But I'm sure you guys are going to do very well. All right. So if there's nothing else, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you guys. Thank you for hanging in there with me.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.